Thank you, and good morning. So we are here to talk about the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106, specifically mitigation activities that were conducted as a result of the construction of the Oyate Health Center in Rapid City, South Dakota. We're short one team member here, and in fact, the people pictured here are a small subset of the people that actually worked on the project. So most notably, right now, we're missing Scott Winchester. He is our tribal liaison. Seven Generations is a tribally owned architecture and engineering company, as is the rest of the Bodwé Professional Services Group. And so Scott's role as tribal liaison is incredibly important. He's also one of our senior architects. So unfortunately, he couldn't be here with us this week, but he was instrumental in the production of this project. First, where are we? We're in Rapid City. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Rapid City, but we have circled here on the west side of town the site of the Oyate Health Center, and the inset map is the site that is under construction. Construction is now complete, so this is a little bit out of date, but it gives you some context as to how much of the site has changed since construction began. And the focus of this presentation is not to give an exhaustive history as much as we would love to. It is to talk about which activities we were contracted to do as a result of the impact to the historic district that included the Sioux Sanitorium, and before that, the Rapid City Indian School. On this slide, I like to note that the historic site of the Rapid City Indian School was in fact much larger than what we see here in this circle. It encompassed much of what is now Western Rapid City, and the discussion of what happened to those lands is yet another presentation. So there's several layers to this project, and like I said, we're just going to be doing a survey, really, of the tasks that we were contracted to do. But because of our ownership and the significance of the site, historically, as well as to the Native community, especially in Rapid City, but really in West River, South Dakota, and further, we really understand that significance and are really dedicated to doing a good job on many levels. And that goes for the entire team, of course. So again, we talked about where we are. Let's talk about why we're here. There's two slides with this one. The first is the Section 106 itself, requiring federal agencies. In this case, it's Indian Health Service was our client. That was responsible for identifying and assessing the effects of the new construction. And when it was designed in 2017, IHS was the agency building the building. It's now run by the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board, so that was a change in the last few years. But regardless, federal agencies must consider public views and concerns about historic preservation priorities when making important project decisions, and this was a big one. The new clinic, just for reference, is 200,000 square feet, just north of 200,000 square feet, so it's quite large and much needed for the community in Rapid City. And our team is, like I said, not just Seven Generations, but many consultants that are here in South Dakota. Some are in Indiana, and we're just a small subset that get to present to you today. And our work entailed a total of 9 tasks to preserve and respect the history of that land. But why are we here in front of you today talking about it? That is because it's actually part of the project, is to do public presentations. And the audiences of those presentations were dictated in our scope of work as well. So this is actually the third time we're presenting a version of this same presentation and we have one more left to do after we're done here. But this presentation was specifically called out to be to an audience of historic preservation professionals and interested public. So this conference really fit the bill for our work. So thank you for attending and helping us complete this very important project. The COVID-19 pandemic affected so much, and other speakers have talked about that today and yesterday, but this project started in late 2019, and the scope was written really in a different time in so many ways. And so we were quite delayed in getting a lot of the work done, and we are still obviously working on it. We're hoping to be done by the end of the year, but much like construction, those timetables can shift and change. We had hoped to be done in about 2 years, and we're going on 5 now almost. So it's been quite the adventure, and we'll get into some of those stories in the presentation. One thing to note is construction was one thing that was not delayed. So we really had to work in the COVID environment to get the work done before demolition occurred on site for the new construction. So that involved driving out here to South Dakota from Michigan to do that site documentation work that fed into several of our tasks. So like I alluded to earlier, there are 9 separate and distinct tasks as part of this project. Really, each task is a project in and of itself, and we'll go into some of them very briefly here at the top, and then we'll go into details as we get going. So task number 1, and they're not necessarily in chronological order here. This is the order in which they were written into the scope of work, but task 1 is fittingly historic context. And establishing the significance of the site. We'll talk about how we did that. Architectural documentation, that's something that's changed quite a lot since Y2K. I'm kind of slipping that in there for the theme of the conference. So I hope that will be subtle occasionally. Task 3 is a rehabilitation plan. I've noted which ones are complete. The ones that don't say complete are still work in progress. Some of them are very, very, very close, but we're not quite there yet. The pictorial or interpretive display is complete, so if you're ever in Rapid City and you want to take a look at it, it's up now in the Oyate Health Center. The interpretive booklet, we haven't quite started that yet, but hopefully here probably in the next week or 2. The reevaluation of property eligibility, Ben will be talking about that in great detail. Task 7 is presentations. So that's us here. We're not quite complete with that. Sensitivity training, that was the first task that we completed because, like I said, construction activities did not wait for COVID to resolve itself. And archaeological monitoring and response is task 9, and that was also ongoing during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is now complete, as all construction activity on the site is now complete. So just going into each of these in a little bit more detail. Task 1 involved archive research, which was fantastic. That was our first time to appear here at the State Archives, and we were met by quite hospitable hosts and enjoyed our time very much in the archives and doing that research. Oral history collection, which was challenging on so many levels, as you can imagine, and producing a historic context report. Task 2, we work to preserve contributing structures via 2D drawings, which is very much up our alley in architecture and engineering, and we'll talk about how we did that and how that's changed in the last 25 years. The rehabilitation plan to provide possible new uses for historic structures. So of the structures that were on the site, 3 remain, and we had to work on envisioning what those might be used as in the future. And as I think many of you know, one of the best ways to preserve historic buildings is to use historic buildings and to have them be seen as significant and important in communities. So that was task number 3. Task 4 is an interpretive display. Like I said, that's now been installed. And task 5, that booklet, is going to be kind of like an exhibit guide that'll go into a little bit more detail than the display had room for, so we're excited to elaborate. Task 6, we're evaluating the integrity of the historic fabric as it was determined to be eligible but not listed on the National Register. Task 7 is to give 3 public presentations to various audiences, that's today, and 8, prepare contractors for work on the OHC site. We'll talk about how we did that as well, and it really was quite successful throughout the project. And ensuring proper documentation and response. And those two are kind of linked together because the contractors on the site were a partner in ensuring that everything was responded to appropriately and documented. So task 1, I don't expect you to read all of this. It's quite small. I bolded a couple things. So establishing context, how does one go about doing that? The scope says we, the contractor, shall prepare a historic context report documenting the development and operation of the property during both the Indian school and sanitorium periods of significance. And just for reference, that's 1898 for the boarding school through 1933. And the second period started in 1938 and went through 66. Conduct archival research at local and state archives as well as federal archives. So we had a field trip in there, several of them. Collect those photographs, drawings, and maps in those archives. Collect 10 to 20 oral history interviews, which as you can imagine during the COVID-19 pandemic, that was incredibly difficult as we were asking to speak with some of the most vulnerable populations. And so that was on hold for quite some time, and only recently did we complete that work. Producing transcripts as well as some basic metadata. These will be archived as well, so prepare for those. Those are coming. We're just wrapping that up, getting all the final consent forms and everything in line. So that will be coming here soon. In fact, earlier this week I was collecting a couple that were outstanding, as well as an appendix that represents the information collected in the archives. As we know, very few archives are digitized. That's especially true for record group number 75. And for those of you who don't know, that is the Bureau of Indian Affairs records at the National Archives. This was taken probably about a week ago, this screenshot of the website. And they have a tracker here that tracks the percentage of records that have been digitized or scanned in some way and are available online. And for those of you who can't read that, that's 3.035%, which is actually higher by almost a whole percentage point from when we started the project. So they're making progress, but it's very slow, time-consuming, and as we've talked about, very expensive. So we really had to go to the NARA locations in DC as well as Kansas City and sit with folders upon folders and boxes upon boxes. And was very eye-opening when we were there. So this is Ben and I with our researcher passes and our request slips. We like to take in-progress photos of what we're doing. So when we do presentations like this, we can include, yes, we were actually there, we did it. And that was almost, I'm taking a picture there. It's almost 5,000 images of documents. Now, that's not 5,000 documents. Most are multi-page, but you can imagine between all the archives, me sitting there with my iPad, and if something was even remotely related to the site, snapped a picture and I'll read it later, was the idea. So we had very limited time in each of these institutions, and they were just opening up from COVID. So there was a lot of limited access, a wait list, probably as long as my arm, to get into some of these places. So it was a challenge. And this is the archive index that we prepared. Now we are not professional archivists. Okay, so forgive us, but we did every single image that we took. we created some very basic metadata and descriptions for our use primarily, because we have a larger research team than could go to the archives with us and certainly read the material that we were looking at. So we had to figure out a way to effectively share all of those documents with the entire research team that was working on the variety of tasks that this research supported. So all 9 tasks were supported by this research. So we needed to figure out, okay, how do we sort them? We came up with some subject codes. Everything, of course, is labeled on the left side with the item location and the folder and all of the box numbers. All of that is there, so it could be tracked back. If somebody wanted to go back and do additional research on any subject, they could at least find the box that that was in. And so we wanted to give that there. And then on the right side of the screen is the data that we created around that. Brief descriptions, keywords, subject codes, so that we could start to organize it and pare it down from so many. This is just one tab, so each institution got a tab at the bottom. So that was really quite the task just to do the index, let alone start to digest what we had collected. So monumental task there. But we did find some amazing pieces. And I don't expect you to read some of the stuff that's here, but I've clipped some of the key quotes on the left side. So one of these is a letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs talking about the South Dakota State Fair and the prize-winning work of the students that were enrolled in the school. I think what these gave us a perspective on is that the daily life of the students and how it related to maybe other institutions, other public institutions in that same period. And we're still doing this today, right? Students are entering their work in state fairs and other county competitions. So that was really an interesting perspective that you don't get a lot of the time unless you're looking at these letters. And then the menu, food is a connector to us here together today, but also to people in the past, what we ate. And that's a very tangible piece of history. I pulled out Tuesday's breakfast here. This is the winter menu, and there were several of them. But I pulled out that breakfast was cornmeal mush, bread and butter, fried potatoes, and coffee. So we were giving our kids coffee to prepare them for the day. I'm not sure if we would do that today, but that was an interesting anecdote for sure. I'm sure it kept them warm. Pretty cold up there in the winter. And there are a number of student records. So most of these records from the Rapid City Indian School are held in Kansas City. We talked about access. Several speakers talked about access to archives. Many students have family members and relatives alive today that are interested in seeing some of these things. Unfortunately, we got a very small snippet of student records. There's the tip of the iceberg, really, is what we were able to collect. But we did provide that index as well to the Oglala Lakota College and some other local partners that we built relationships with, so that those who are doing research or similar topics might have a starting point for their research to help narrow their search, or maybe discover that those student records do exist and it's possible that they have them there in Kansas City. So this letter in particular is from a parent, or from the superintendent back to a parent who's requesting admission for their students. And I think this highlights some of the requests, at least at this time, for students to be enrolled throughout West River, South Dakota, and sent to the Rapid City Indian School. And the reasons cited were varied somewhat significantly, but in this case, due to poor home conditions that prevent them from being a successful student at more local schools. And the last piece is an autograph book, and like I said about the food and the menu, it connects us to things that we still do today. And when we're leaving for summer vacation, ours look a little bit different than this. But this is not something that we encountered in our archive research, but a result of partnerships. When we reached out to the Oglala Lakota College and their then archivist, she recommended that we look at this and some other pieces that she had related to the Rapid City Indian School. So things we would not have found otherwise. We were not contracted, to reach out to the archives at the OLC, but we discovered things by building relationships, right? And I think that's what this conference too is all about, is building relationships, because we all know various things and we want to share them. So this is a very personal note in an autograph book asking to be remembered after their school time is done.
Well, as Alex mentioned, our task for the historic context was to look at the period 1898 to 1966, covering the significance of the Rapid City Indian School and the Sioux Sanatorium. Now, I'm guessing most people in this room know something about the Federal Indian Boarding School program, but just for a very brief overview, treaties between the government of the United States and various tribes generally included provisions of education and medical care for tribal citizens in perpetuity in exchange for cession of tribal land to the United States. So the federal government has an obligation under those treaties to provide education. In the late 19th century, the federal government started to turn away from funding private schools, generally run by church missions, toward opening its own public boarding schools. The first and most famous was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania that opened in 1879. And it was really the model of a military school and was intended to assimilate Indian children into the dominant culture, specifically a white Anglo-American Protestant culture of the eastern United States. And that model was used for multiple campuses throughout the country. By the late 1890s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs decided to start building schools that were closer to the reservations where many of these students' families lived, as opposed to shipping students halfway across the continent, providing schools that were more accessible, where students would have more of a chance to have contact with their families, although that was sometimes discouraged. So the Rapid City Indian School was part of a wave of schools that were built across the Great Plains states in the late 1890s. And when it first opened in 1898, this building was the whole school. It was classrooms, dormitory, dining hall, kitchen, everything in that building, except for the laundry, which was in a small building behind. Over the next roughly 2 decades, it developed into a relatively large campus. Now, this was on the smaller scale for a federal boarding school, but it was at its peak about 350 students max. And in the top row, you can see from the left the old main building, which became the boys' dormitory. In the middle, the 2 girls' dormitories. On the right, the new boys' dormitory that replaced the original after it burned. In the lower row, the domestic science building, the large classroom building, the smaller classroom building and chapel, and the gymnasium. Now, because this campus was in the country outside of Rapid City, faculty and staff typically lived on campus in their own housing. Single employees lived in a boarding house together, while employees who were married and had families were given a cottage or a bungalow for their family to reside in. The upper left building that looks like a house was actually the staff and faculty office building. In the lower row, you can see some barns. Now, this school included a farm, and if you know much about the history of American education, at the turn of the 20th century, there was a big debate over the purpose of American education in public schools. Traditional education had been what we would call college prep education. It was focused on reading, writing, arithmetic, the skills you would need to go to college. Now, in 1899, out of Americans between ages 18 and 24, 2% were in college. So most students would not go to college. And education reformers said, well, we need to do a better job of training students for the work they're actually going to be doing when they get done with school. And the most popular solution was what was called manual training, or what we would call vocational education. So in cities, you would often train students in trades relevant to that area. So in Pennsylvania, you might learn to be a steel worker. But in more rural locations, it was common to have agricultural training for boys, teaching them modern scientific agricultural practices, and domestic science training for girls, which could give them the skills to either find work as a domestic servant or the skills that was assumed they would need to be wives and mothers managing their own households going forward. So the agricultural buildings you see here were part of the curriculum for boys on the campus. Alex mentioned the recognition of the school's agricultural work at the South Dakota State Fair. These schools operated in some ways like the agricultural extension of a state university. They were intended to provide a model, including for white farmers in the surrounding country, of the modern way to do things. In this period, it was considered really important to turn away from traditional practices in all cultures, that you shouldn't farm like your grandfather. You should do it the modern scientific way based on the latest evidence. Now, at the Indian boarding schools, this was layered on top of an attempt to remove students from their culture, from their languages. So there's a lot of complicated history here. The campus also was primarily a living and learning space for students. So here you can see some images of the dormitories, the classrooms, the dining halls, the auditorium and chapel, the spaces that the students occupied on a daily basis. The school was also known for its student organizations, from its band to its athletic teams, which we've heard quite a bit about in oral histories from descendants of students at the school. Now, I mentioned that education was very different in this period. So when the school opened, it was 4th through 8th grade. They started to add lower grades because many parents preferred to send all of their children as a group to the school so that all the children could remain together as a family. And for that reason, the school added grades 1 through 3 to keep up with that. So at the end of the period this school operated, in the 1930s, the average number of years of school completed by all Americans was between 8th and 9th grade. So a school that operated through 8th grade was what most people would have gotten through. Some graduates of the Rapid City Indian School went on to attend Rapid City High School, and to do that, because they were generally not the children of residents of the city, they had to pay tuition. And the superintendents of the school would try to obtain federal funding to pay for that so these students could go on. Some students went on to attend the South Dakota School of Mines or other colleges, but most students would have graduated from 8th grade and then proceeded into the workforce. Now, this school operated until 1933. The campus closed for a period, and it was occupied by some New Deal agencies, and Peggy Sanders provided us some valuable information about that period, which was not well documented. In 1936, the Bureau of Indian Affairs decided to convert the campus into a sanatorium for the treatment of tuberculosis. Now, as many of you probably know, tuberculosis was a widespread disease in the United States in this period, and there was really no effective medical treatment other than rest, fresh air, and sunlight. So this was a facility that provided the level of treatment that was available in that period to tribal citizens living in this region. The sanatorium opened in 1938. Now, in the 1940s, treatments for tuberculosis that were effective were developed, including antibiotics. And over the course of the 1950s and early 1960s, treatment changed radically, and most sanatoria were closed in that period because the type of treatment they offered was no longer necessary. Here we have an aerial view of the campus in 1958. In 1955, the Indian Health Service was created, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs transferred this sanatorium and other similar properties to the Indian Health Service, which retained it up until recent years. Now, as part of the development of this historic context, we looked at the histories of individual buildings on the campus to understand its evolution over time. To do that, we looked at a variety of sources. We had a number of maps of the campus, often drawn to show utilities. This was a water plan. We have some aerial photographs from the later years. This is a plan for inserting the new Sioux Sanatorium building into the old campus, showing the buildings that were remaining. Again, aerial photographs. You can see in the front the Sioux Sanatorium building with the older campus buildings behind. The State Archives had a collection of the prospectuses that were published by the school. These were essentially advertising booklets that were sent out to the families of prospective students, that advertised the curriculum at the school, what it could offer, with many photographs, which were very helpful to us to understand the conditions of the campus. It included information, for example, here about the medical equipment and the school hospital. Later on, they published brochures, again, that talked about what the school could offer and why someone might want to send their children there. In this case, you can see it's advertising the training programs in dairying, raising poultry, domestic science, carpentry, sewing, shoe and harness making, laundry, etc. And this information was very helpful. These often also talk about the school's athletic programs and the kind of recreation that was provided on campus. They often had a movie on Friday or Saturday nights in the chapel building, things like that. The school was also featured in local newspapers especially, but also sometimes in national newspapers that would carry stories about the conditions at the non-reservation schools. Now, Alex mentioned those thousands of documents we looked at the National Archives, and here are pictures of just a few. So sometimes there would be information specifically about buildings, but often it was a report, say, on the condition of the domestic science curriculum, and there would be a note saying, the inspector thinks the curriculum is good, but the building needs some improvements, or you don't have enough equipment, or they need more funding, or they need more staff. That was a frequent issue. As you can imagine with most federal appropriations, there's never enough money to keep up with what needs to be done. In very rare cases, we had detailed architectural documentation. This was the new classroom building that was built in 1919 to 1920. You'll notice on the blueprint there's a mistake. It says Rapid City, North Dakota. And we believe this was a standard design that the BIA used at other schools, and the architect wasn't paying too much attention when he lettered this sheet and made a mistake. On the right, you can see a construction progress report with some construction photos and notes. And in this case, we even had submittals for the stamped metal shingles for the roof, but we did not have this much documentation for most of the buildings. And I'll take you through just a few of the buildings on campus. So I mentioned the school and chapel. So this was built in 1903 to move the classrooms out of the main building so that they could have more dormitories for the boys. And it contained 4 classrooms in the front wing and then the chapel and auditorium in the rear wing. After the bigger classroom building was built in 1920, the front wing was gutted and turned into a larger dining hall, which again freed up more space in the boys' dormitory for additional dorms. The brick barn was part of the agricultural program. This was the horse barn and used for storage of vehicles. Now, because the school, again, was out in the country, they often needed vehicles to go to and from town with goods or to take students to and from the railroad station. This building survives today. The upper gable has been altered and most of the windows have been bricked up, but it's still there and is otherwise relatively intact. Now, if you've ever walked around a historic school building, you're probably aware that kids like to carve into bricks and wood and whatever they could find. And this was an interesting one. So this brick was carved by Oscar J. Weasel, February 15th, 1917. And 2 months later, he deployed to World War I as a 19-year-old. He was in Company I of the South Dakota National Guard and served with distinction. This is something that you may also be aware of, that students from these schools enlisted in high numbers in the U.S. Army in the First World War, and the school received an official commendation for the service of its students in the Great War. The campus hospital was originally built in 1906, and in 1924 it was doubled in size to keep up with the demands of both the school population and updates in medical treatment. This expansion included an isolation ward for students with tuberculosis to prevent the spread of the disease among students on campus. I mentioned the office building. So in the late 1930s, with the development of the Sioux Sanatorium, this was one of the buildings that was retained, and it was remodeled as a staff apartment building for the staff of the hospital. And it survived, was later used as an office and for other uses until 2020. Now, this was another standard design used by the BIA at multiple schools. So it had twins at Pierre, Wahpeton, and Albuquerque that we were able to identify, and there may have been more. I mentioned the domestic science building, And this included what we would call today immersive learning spaces. So girls in the domestic science classes had a kitchen, a laundry, and a dining room where they could go through the coursework and basically practice being their own housekeepers. It also included an apartment for the domestic science teacher and her family. This building was again remodeled as staff housing for the sanatorium in the 1930s and was demolished in 2020. The principal's cottage was part of the neighborhood of faculty and staff dwellings, and it was built sometime between 1904 and 1908. In the late 1930s, it got a smaller colonial revival front porch and was later used as an office building until it too was demolished. Now that original main building, or the old boys dormitory, burned down in 1922, and they temporarily converted the gym into the boys dormitory. But we have multiple letters from the superintendent saying this is an unsatisfactory condition and we can't have students living in a gym. So he was able to get funding to rebuild in 1923. This building was later known as Lakota Lodge. In the late 1930s, it was remodeled as a dormitory for nurses at the sanatorium, and it was later used as offices. It was demolished in 2022, I believe. The engineer's cottage was reportedly built using, in part, leftover material from the construction of the new boys' dormitory around 1923. Now, this building connects to some interesting stories. So Benjamin Black Fox was a survivor of the Wounded Knee Massacre. As a one-year-old, he was found wrapped in a blanket next to the body of his mother the day after the massacre. And he was later a student at Rapid City Indian School, graduated, attended the South Dakota School of Mines, and was later hired by the Bureau of Indian Affairs as a campus engineer managing the heating and cooling and water systems of other schools like this. In 1919, he got married, and the school where he was working did not have living quarters for married staff, so he asked to be transferred to Rapid City, where they could provide him housing for him and his wife, and then for their children. So his family occupied this house from the time of its construction until about 1940. When the school closed, Black Fox was placed in charge of managing the campus after it had been shuttered, and was left in charge during its occupation by the New Deal programs. And Peggy shared with us some quotes from a woman who was the daughter of a CCC worker whose family was quartered on the campus in the mid-1930s. And she said, Mr. Black Fox was in charge, and he knew everything, and his children played with us. And that gave us some clues to his family still being there. When the Sioux Sanatorium was built, Black Fox was hired again as the campus engineer to manage it, and he served in that role until his death in 1940. Next door was the chief clerk's cottage, again another bungalow built in the mid-20s. This one you can see had been altered quite a bit and had suffered over the years in its use as an office building. And with that, I'll turn it back to Alex.
Okay. So not only did we do archive research, but we looked at published works, not just specifically about the Rapid City Indian School or the Sioux Sanitarium, but generally about education of Native youth in this period, as well as adjacent or peer institutions like Pipestone or Pier, for example. Sources of knowledge are diverse, and one of the most important sources of knowledge is storytelling, particularly among Native Americans as well as, and specifically the Lakota. And so we had the privilege to interview these 4 women here, but we had 15 interviews with 17 individual narrators, which is a big deal. If you've ever done oral histories before, getting 1 is a challenge. Getting up to 20, as our scope called for, was a lot for us to do, especially being outside of the community and being based in Michigan and Indiana and other places. Building relationships became incredibly important. And it turned out that when you build that trust with one person and you sit with them and they understand who you are and what you're trying to accomplish, they're going to, and often was our experience, they gave us the next person to talk to and said, you must talk to my cousin, and they're going to lead you on in that chain. Unfortunately, during COVID, several prospective narrators passed on. And that was incredibly difficult for not just the project, of course, but that knowledge and that understanding was lost as well. So this oral history is certainly not the only oral history project that's ever been done on this subject or even with these individuals, but we hope that it is preserved and remains accessible, both, of course, at the state archives, but also we gave narrators the option if they wanted to archive their interview with the Oglala Lakota College. And as probably most of you know, they have a distributed campus across kind of West River, South Dakota, and is often the most accessible institution on tribal lands. And so keeping those stories in the community became really important, and in a way that we could build trust. So that, and we also offered permissions and other restrictions. Only tribal citizens can access your interview or others. So that was really critical. And like I said, these 4 women were just amazing. A privilege to sit and talk to them for any length of time. So that kind of, the oral histories gave us the frame in a lot of ways to view what we discovered in the archives or uncovered in the archives. Archives are wonderful, but they are one perspective often. And they are often what one white, typically man, decided was important enough to save, especially in the early 1900s. And so we knew going in that it would be a treasure trove of information, but it would lack the lived experience of those whose families were impacted by the site, not just during the Indian school, but in the sanatorium, and even through to the present day. One thing we didn't note explicitly, which is kind of a segue into the next slide, is that this sanatorium, built in 1938, was the IHS hospital for West River, South Dakota, for most specialties. So many families are driving off reservation to come to Rapid City to get a higher level of care, and this was the place. As you can imagine, a building built as a tuberculosis sanatorium in 1938 was completely inadequate for contemporary healthcare needs, and the needs are great, of course, for all communities. So documenting the structures. We spent a lot of time on task 1, but that's because it was so massive. These will go a little bit faster, but documenting structures was very important before the demolition began. We booked it out here twice before demolition in our minivan, our team, to document these structures that were going to be demolished or otherwise adversely impacted by the construction. That was a huge effort. And like Ben noted, existing drawings did not exist for a lot of these buildings. So we had to kind of start from scratch. How did we do that? Well, in 2000, that would have been with a tape measure and a pencil and a very crude sketch. And if you're familiar with the Historic American Building Survey, there are levels to that level of documentation. And in some levels, that is completely acceptable, especially when existing drawings do not exist or did not survive. But with technology, here's my second plug here for what's changed since Y2K, is we were able to do LiDAR scanning. Not only was it available, it was light and it was portable, relatively speaking. That's still pretty heavy and ungainly to move around, but in 1 week, we scanned all 19 structures, which is huge and quite the feat, and still to this day the largest set of scans that we as an organization have ever taken. We did everything from, as you can see here, scanning the sandstone rubble wall, the retaining wall on the south side of the campus, kind of really the distinctive feature if you ever drive by it. It's kind of the south border of campus, and bigger buildings like the sanatorium or the Lakota Lodge that Ben shared earlier. But this site plan kind of shows which buildings fell into our scope to scan, and we spent many hours well into the evening doing that scanning work. It skipped on me. There we go. So these are the buildings. The ones that are gray are no longer extant. Those were demolished, many of which Ben just gave you some overview, history of. The ones that are in color still remain. That's the barn. The little one that looks like a field of grass is actually a root cellar, so most of which you can't see. It's underground, but it's there, promise, still there. And then the wall itself was the last remaining historic structure. That includes some historic signage that you saw some details of in previous slides. The drawings we produced were certainly more detailed than a napkin sketch, and were dimensioned and have details that show interior doors, exterior doors, and really we tried to capture the character and the use of the building as it was at that time. Some of these made it into the pictorial display that we'll talk about in a little bit, but the most significant of the structures, the most recognizable, and from the bottom of the hill, if you're driving by, you could see for almost 100 years, this building here, Susan. This is one of the 3 floor plans that were produced. So task 3, rehabilitation. Our task was not to design the rehabilitation strategy, but rather envision appropriate uses. And that has kind of many layers. On the kind of definition layer, Secretary of Interior Standards, we were charged with finding a compatible contemporary use for these buildings, but also as an architecture team, and caring about this community, we wanted to envision uses that would be useful to the patient population today. And we'll look at some of that here in a second. So returning the property to a state of utility, which makes possible an efficient contemporary use, while also preserving the features of the building that make it a historic building. And so Ben noted that several changes have happened to these buildings. The barn was being used to store lawnmowers and other lawn equipment, so not all that different from its use originally. But a lot of the historic features had been altered. The openings had been blocked up, new doors had been inserted, and so we collected that information and made recommendations about what could be done to make that building usable again, and usable with the patients and staff in mind at the building. So we developed some diagrams and some visioning images. I mean, being in a coffee shop that is a historic brick building is a very cozy feeling, at least for us and for me, and that was one of the potential uses that was proposed. There's no food on the campus, and like I said earlier, food is a connector, has been a connector on the site for since time immemorial, really. I should say that this site has been in use long before 1898. We did find some evidence of that as well in our archaeological monitoring, but it's been a site of significance for a very, very long time. So that was one of the suggestions for the root cellar. It was a little bit more challenging, as you can imagine. What do you do with a root cellar that isn't a root cellar? Not many people need a root cellar these days. I mean, if you have one, great, but we usually use refrigerators. We don't need the coolness of the earth today to keep our food fresh. And so we were trying to think again, on the subject of food, bringing healthy food and thinking about the social determinants of health, which again is another presentation, but healthy food is essential to health. It's foundational. And so we were trying to think of how we could bring healthy foods on campus more often so that patients and their families who are driving from all over can have access to food there on site. And so some kind of farmer's market or other similar organized event could happen in and around the root cellar while maintaining those kind of historic aspects that make it an important part of the history and could still be interpreted in that space. Of course, there's no egress from a root cellar, so to actually inhabit a space, we have to make it a safe and accessible space. So there were some challenges there, and that those challenges are not uncommon in historic preservation work. So this was just uniquely challenging considering it's subterranean, which the Cultural Heritage Center could understand. And so the last piece was the wall, the retaining wall. And we knew that a memorial walk was being planned for the new clinic after it was opened, and it was in fact built. We walked it the other day. And so the idea here was to connect that memorial walk on site to some other memorials that are being planned around the campus. Like I said, most of those lands that surround what is now the site were part of the school at one time or another. And so just across the way, there's another memorial being put on by the Remembering the Children group. So I've heard that that is moving forward, and that's really exciting to see. So we wanted to connect that so patients who are waiting or family members who are waiting for other patients might go outside and read some interpretive signage about the history of the site. One of the things that we found is that many people were not aware of the site's history. This should come as no surprise to anybody in the room, but it was a surprise to us a little bit, that a lot of people were born and received treatment inside the sanitorium and had no idea about its history, what it was, and some of those darker moments of the site's history. And so part of our work, in addition to the presentations and in addition to a kind of public education, was to develop a permanent display that goes inside the clinic so that people can come in, visit, learn a little bit. Again, tip of the iceberg here, we had a very small space, but we tried to pack in as much as we could about the site history and its significance. Our scope of work, however, did not reflect what we actually did. We diverted quite substantially. The scope of work essentially had us framing 8 to 12 historic photographs that were to be put up at random throughout the building with no interpretation whatsoever. The only criteria was that they were historic photos. And we said, I think we can do better. And I think we can do better for this community, and I think they deserve more than some contextless black and white photographs. So we took that, and Seven Generations donated the difference between what it would cost to frame 8 photographs to what it would cost to design an entire interpretive display, produce the display, and deliver the display. And so we'll get into what we did there. This was the original plan. We did a lot of planning during COVID because we couldn't do a lot of doing. So we made plans upon plans upon plans. Some of them worked out. This is one that did. It looks very similar to what we had hoped to do here, essentially a 4x8 space that was broken up into various panels and installed on the wall like so, using French cleats. And we developed kind of a fabrication plan, and it was supposed to be done by the grand opening. That was February 2023. That did not happen. That part of the plan did not happen. But the grand opening brought together people that would not normally come to the site, leaders of various tribal nations, as well as the Rapid City community came out for this grand opening, and we wanted to have a presence so people could learn about what was being done. A lot of press went around about people not knowing when the construction was happening, and that was hard. And so we wanted to take that opportunity to educate as well as invite people to participate in the oral histories, to invite them to tell us why the site was so significant to them. And some did actually follow up with this. But this is the temporary display that we developed for the grand opening. It's almost a 7-foot foam core piece that stood up until the actual display was ready. And this just outlines those periods of significance that we were talking about. That's content that's on that display, which is, of course, too small to see on the slide. This is what we ended up with at the end. This is what was designed. We felt it was important to acknowledge the 18 tribes in the service area. This is not just the 3 primary tribes that receive service here. These are all of the tribes that are eligible to receive service here. One of the things that we didn't mention is the Rapid City Indian School was kind of pan-tribal in a lot of ways. People came from all over, not just South Dakota and not just the adjacent states. I think we found some letters from people from Alaska wondering if there was room to send their students here. So it was definitely a multi-tribal space during its time as an Indian school. If you're interested, I highly encourage you to go take a look next time you're in Rapid City. The 2 pieces on the left and the right are digital displays. At the beginning of this project, we had no idea how to develop or program a digital display, but we figured it out, and I think that was one of the other successes. And I have a video here, and I'm hoping it plays. This is the left display. The music is not important, but essentially what it goes through is selected press articles that predate the Indian School in 1893 and go all the way through to the end of the sanitorium era. So it gives patients the opportunity to click. The purple circle indicates a click. So whenever you see that, it's like you're pushing on the button. It gives patients and visitors the opportunity to learn about what the press was actually saying at the time about the school or about the sanatorium, which is an important perspective. Today, we have opinions based on our context. They also had opinions based on their context, and that was important to outline. And then if you wait, it goes on to play the entire article, and you can read from top to bottom. This is a much truncated clip for this purpose, so if you're actually there, it doesn't move quite this quickly on the right. And then on the left is a summary of the kind of important parts of what we thought were important parts of the article, but wanted to make sure that the original was there so that they could reference it. And this is going to go, it's about halfway done. All of the articles are organized by topic, so education, health, sports. So if somebody was interested in a particular subject, like the basketball team, they could look for the color that indicates sports and look at those articles in particular. Of course, further reading is always important because, like I said, the tip of the iceberg, as well as some QR codes to other institutions that have information on this era, as well as information on tuberculosis, as well as boarding schools in that era, because this is just a little bit of the information available. So that is what plays, and you tap to begin. On the right side, we have kind of a highlight reel, if you will, of what we did for this project. So the scope of work called for us to highlight kind of what we're doing here, what was done, because that, to a lot of community members, wasn't communicated. They just thought buildings were coming down and nobody was doing any kind of historic preservation work or story preservation work. So this is the project highlights, and it will go also very quickly. A lot of these historic photographs you've already seen. There are more if you're there in person. Archaeological monitoring, artifacts were broken into 3 categories. What you're seeing here is some of the education, but we selected a few kind of artifacts that speak to life at the site during its periods of significance. That was a report card there. You probably couldn't read that. We also wanted to make sure that the buildings were accessible. So you can click on all 19 structures in orange, and if you pull that up, that comes our architectural drawings as well as photographs that were taken prior to demolition. We're going to jump ahead here, maybe, or backwards. So much for trying to make it go faster. Okay, we'll move on. So installing the display, we missed our ship window. That did not go to plan. So yours truly drove out in a snowstorm in late December from Michigan, from Kalamazoo, Michigan, to Rapid City to install it before the end of the year. And we were successful in that. That's what it looks like installed. It's on the first floor across from the elevators. The interpretive booklet, we haven't started yet, but we're on the hook for producing 1,000 copies of the booklet. It's going to be 30 pages in length. And the reevaluation of property, Ben's going to talk about.
Prior to this project, a potential National Register district had been identified on the campus with the remaining buildings from the Rapid City Indian School and the Sioux Sanatorium. The scope of work for this task was to reevaluate what was left after the demolition of the buildings. Now, we determined through consultation with the State Preservation Office that there is no longer a district. There are 3 separate resources that exist that could potentially be nominated that appear to be eligible. So I mentioned before the 1906 brick barn that you see here on the left. Alex mentioned the 1931 root cellar in the middle. And then the WPA ground improvements on the right. Some people call these the wall or the stone hillside. But these were built by a New Deal agency as a make-work program that improved a federally owned property in the late 1930s and early 1940s. So again, the conclusion that there are 3 separate resources. The periods of significance start with the date of construction of each resource and go up through the end of the sanatorium period. And we identified state-level significance in 3 of the National Register's areas of significance. So ethnic heritage, Native American. Alex mentioned that this was not an exclusively Lakota school, although it was majority Lakota. There were many tribes present, and it fits into the larger context of Native American history in this period in the United States, to the history of education in the United States, and to the history of health and medicine. So in the future, our task did not include nominating these properties, but in the future, this information could be used to nominate these resources.
Okay, I won't belabor presentations. I think we know what that is. But our audiences were local tribal citizens and the general public in Rapid City, tribal citizens living on reservation, and historic preservation professionals and interested persons. So that's you all. These are flyers that we made. We were sending press releases and submitting them to radio, on reservation and off reservation, tribal newspapers, non-tribal newspapers. We really hustled quite a bit to try to get the word out. Sensitivity training. So this is last, but it was first, or one of the last tasks we'll talk about, but it was first. And the reason it was so important was because, like I said, contractors are our partners in, especially when we're dealing with historic sites. Most of them are understandably not trained to identify things that are of potential cultural significance or historic significance. As they're taking down these buildings, it was very common for students or others to hide things in the walls or under the floorboards, toys and the like. So we found a lot of marbles during the construction. But the sensitivity training informed, but also made the contractors aware of their responsibility to their part of helping us preserve the history of this site. We were lucky enough to have all 3 THPOs come to the training from Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, from the Oglala Sioux Tribe and the Rosebud Sioux Tribe, come out to join us in this effort, because to really understand the significance, you have to hear it from them. The archaeological monitoring went through the entire construction and site demolition phases. So they had people on site and on call at all hours whenever there was activity going on. And these are some of the pieces that were found. Some of the people on the site were traditional or tribal cultural specialists. This was incredibly important. And they were selected through the THPO offices from all three tribes. So there was representation throughout the project, throughout the demolition and construction, to make sure that this process was done in a good way. And that is our last slide.